Welcome back to American Family. Our topic today is parents' rights, and with us are two of the leaders of a new organization called Of the People, which is advocating a state constitutional amendment for parents' rights. Jeff Bell, chairman of the organization, has a distinguished background as an author, scholar, senatorial candidate, chairman of a national presidential campaign, and one of the architects of the 1986 tax reform. His colleague, Greg Erken, serves as executive director of the People. And gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Our pleasure.
Thanks for coming out, especially in this weather. Jeff, explain to me why we need yet another state constitutional amendment. It seems that we're always talking about amending constitutions at the state or federal level. I mean, don't parents already have rights?
Well, they should. There's been constitutional decisions by the Supreme Court and other courts, most recently in New York State, that uphold the right of parents to direct the upbringing and education of their children. And yet, I think most parents feel that their sense of control is slipping away at the expense of educational elites, bureaucrats, teachers' unions, that they have less and less say over what actually goes on in the schools and elsewhere.
So, isn't that a big social trend, though, Jeff, that parents are spending less time with their children because they're working more and they're commuting longer, and there are more and more institutions that are involved in the lives of children? It's just inevitable that...
I believe it's a self-reinforcing trend, Mike, and if we let it get too much further, we're going to head toward the situation they have in places like Sweden, where very few parents take care of their children. Almost all are two-earner families, and fewer children are being had within the family.
Well, Greg, what exactly does your amendment say?
Well, the text of the amendment is very simple. It says the right of parents to direct the upbringing and education of their children shall not be infringed. We think coming out with a positive, simple statement of a basic principle like that will put the other side on the defensive for a change.
Okay, but
the other side being whom?
Well,
who's against that?
Well,
yeah, that sounds like something that everybody should be able to accept. Who's against something so
well, that's part of why we wrote it that way, of course. We want the liberals and those who might oppose this to explain why they think parents should not have the primary role and responsibility. I think they have that as a premise, a kind of unspoken premise in many of the things they do, such as condom distribution is one example.
Okay, there's a good
but they've had a hard time being teased out on what the real agenda is.
Well, what are the problems that you're trying to respond to? I mean, obviously you see problems like condom distribution in schools, but what else is there that that has given you the idea of, you know, let's change the law?
Well, I think there are three main areas where a parental rights amendment would have an impact if it were passed by a state. One is that whole area of education, the curriculum. Jennifer has two mommies or whatever.
Right.
And another one, another area would be the general area of health. Even though it isn't always defined rightly, health includes abortion by minors without parental consent and condom distribution, which we just mentioned. The third major area is, in some ways, the most interesting, which is the erosion of the definition of the family. The idea that children should have legal standing to be able to sue their parents on things like cosmetic surgery.
Yes.
Or divorce in some extreme cases.
Is that really a threat, though, or is that just a couple very well-promoted cases?
Well, it's a cutting-edge type of thing for social liberals, that you've had the first successful case of suing parents for divorce down in the state of Florida, and there's no question that the First Lady of this nation has written about the need to give children, which, by the way, I read as lawyers, the right to sue over things like homework assignments and
cosmetic surgery.
Moving. Well, in fact, I remember about 15 years ago, Jeff, there was a case out in Washington State where a 15-year-old girl, I believe it was, sued to get a divorce from her parents. It wasn't granted, but she was given standing because the parents were too strict. And she wanted to move in with some friends of hers, adult friends, who would let her do things that her parents didn't want her to do. There was a boomlet of this children's rights rhetoric back in the late 70s, and then it seems to be coming back. What are the implications of that?
I think it's an attempt to kind of break down the family, to see everyone as atomistic individuals, that there's no relationship, there's no priority, there's no hierarchy, that every family has to be reinvented over again. This idea that there's no such thing as the normal family that we see around as a big assumption of social commentary. All those things seem to be at work.
It really seems to be a question of, is the child a ward of the state or primarily the child of his or her parents? And in some sense, we regret that we have to advocate a parental rights amendment to state constitutions. I think a couple hundred years ago, it's something that our founding fathers took for granted. It was not necessary. Today, that principle is challenged in those areas that Jeff talked about. So,
Well, Jeff, what was the #1 thing that said we need to start this group? What was the real factor that made Jeff Bell sit up and say, we've got to do something?
We felt we had to find a way into victories on the social issues. We had to find the Grenada of the social issues. And by that I mean, when Ronald Reagan invaded the little island state of Grenada in 1983, people scoffed at it. They said this is unimportant. But in fact, it was a very important event because it changed the psychology of both sides of the Cold War. It was the first time that a Marxist-Leninist state, having been established, was in fact overthrown. Just 11 years ago was the first time that happened. Now we've had virtually every Soviet-style dictatorship overthrown. And I think it changed the psychology. It led later that year to SDI, to the announcement of the Reagan Doctrine, later stingers to Afghanistan, and an empire, the Soviet empire, that seemed to be invulnerable, unraveled because Grenada showed that it could be rolled back, and the fact that Reagan chose the weakest outpost of the Soviet empire was really a good thing, because you have to start somewhere.
I see what you're talking about in terms of history and international relations. How does that connect with
Where could you better start than to find a vulnerable outpost where, in effect, the other side is saying that parents should have less say over their children. Make them make that explicit, and then make them explain why they don't think parental rights should be established by statute.
I see. So in other words, what you're trying to do with this strategy is by reasserting the rights of parents, you put anybody who would infringe on those rights on the defensive.
That's right. And then it will give an umbrella to address a whole series of other issues involving curriculum, condom distribution, definition of the family, abortion without parental notification, that type of thing.
there's a lot of movements out there in the grassroots, various coalitions and parents groups that spring up in reaction to these infringements in these different areas.
And we're going to talk more about those when we come back. But right now we have to take a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our discussion, and we're going to take your phone calls, so stay with us. Welcome back to American Family, where we're discussing parental rights, or the lack of parental rights, with Jeff Bell and Greg Erken of the People. And if you have a question or a comment on this subject, now's the time to call and get in on the discussion at 1-800-5000-NET.
Well, Betsy, we have a caller already from Marshall, North Carolina.
Great.
Marshall, thanks for calling. You with us?
Yeah, first of all, I have no disagreement with you fellas' position there. I'm for family values, but I have this question. If you could get your amendment passed and all, what makes you think it would be treated any differently than our present Second Amendment is? For example,
Right.
the judiciary in this country has basically destroyed the acknowledgement of the Constitution. I'll hang up and listen.
Great question.
All right.
Jeff?
I believe the answer to that is that we have a political judiciary. They do tend to follow the election returns. And one thing that happens is if an issue is intensely debated, then there are pro and con arguments used on both sides during that debate. It's a little harder for a liberal judge who might want to repeal it to go against the grain of what has just happened relatively recently.
Now, Jeff, explain to me why you decided you're going state by state to try to get amendments in each state. You decided to do that versus going for one federal amendment in the federal Constitution.
That's right.
Why is that?
That's right, Betsy. We're not against the idea of going toward a national amendment, but we wanted to adopt the model of the term limits movement and try to see if we can get this idea understood in 1 or 2 or 3 states in the first year, and then it'll spread like wildfire once people realize that it will give them standing to sue the bureaucrats and to get judges to rule correctly on issues of this type.
Well, isn't it also true that most of the programs that invade the privacy of families, in effect, are state programs, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, education is still almost entirely at the state level. One other thing that might reassure the caller is a recent decision handed down by the New York State Appellate Court in the New York City condom distribution case. That decision, even though New York State does not have a parental rights amendment, they cited the language of the parental rights amendment in that decision.
Very good.
The Parental Rights Amendment, I should add, is based on Supreme Court language from the 1920s that's never been overturned and has been cited by the Supreme
That would
Court.
be from the Pierce decision.
Pierce and Myers.
Myers,
right.
yes. Okay.
And
Those are classic
basically,
cases.
the New York judges, and they haven't, that it may not be appealed, but it was won on a 3-2 vote. They said that New York City could no longer distribute condoms to school children without parental consent.
Right.
So there, in one instance, is a judge who made the right decision.
Now, of course, that's a decision that applies only in New York State, right?
That's right.
Nonetheless,
And,
a very good decision.
We're working to have a similar suit filed in the District of Columbia, which has,
Oh.
as you may know,
Won't that be
a similar
interesting?
policy.
Yes.
And we'll talk about that in a second, but while we're on the subject of New York, we have a caller from Buffalo, New York. Buffalo, you're on the line.
Yes, ma'am. I'm concerned about these gay Avengers that were going around to the elementary schools. And also, we've had a homosexual group called ACT UP handing out condoms at our school. What can we do to have these people, these interest groups, arrested? Our child's safety or our child's mental health, it cannot be protected on the elementary school grounds. They can't be arrested.
Let's back up a second and explain for our viewers who don't know what that is. We talked about this 2 nights ago. The Lesbian Avengers is a small group of radical activist women who came, lesbian, who came onto an elementary school campus in Springfield, Massachusetts on Valentine's Day and passed out flyers that said, women loving women is a beautiful thing, girls loving girls is wonderful, some girls grow up to love women, that's great. If you want to know how, give us a call. Here's our 900 number. They passed out candy. They wore jackets that said, "We recruit," and they literally went in there recruiting these young girls. They came and went before school officials could get a hold of them. This was not a school-sponsored thing, and of course parents are outraged, although it wouldn't be that surprising, frankly, in some areas if it were, but parents are outraged and are trying to figure out how to go after these women. The best they can come up with is general trespassing.
Trespass, yeah. Okay. What's your angle on that? What's your read on that kind of issue?
Well, parents, most reasonable parents aren't going to be opposed to that. The question they're facing is how to get there from here, that is how to effectively stop those kind of things. I think we have to start with a basic principle that the parents are the primary decision makers for their children in these areas such as education, and that when they send their child off to a public school, they don't want to feel like they are ceding complete authority from 9 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon.
Offer a hypothetical case. Say the state of Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the state of New York, where the caller's from, had adopted the Parental Rights Amendment. What difference would that make if the Lesbian Avengers or ACT UP came onto a school campus distributing flyers to kids?
I think that if the school, if they cannot utilize a simple trespassing statute, if the school tried to come around and use some type of diversity argument or the argument that condoms are necessary to combat AIDS or teenage pregnancy or whatever they might use, they stay with the Parental Rights Amendment enacted will give parents much better legal standing to shift the argument away from the relative merits of condoms or particular curricula program towards the question of who decides.
Well, what about if, and the school may be able to get them on simple trespassing, but a lot of these parents are pretty outraged, and they don't want them on simple trespassing. They want them on something a lot more serious because this is so serious.
They've traumatized these children.
That's right. Would this amendment give them any power in addition to trespassing?
I think it would give them power to the extent to which the school authorities could be shown to have made this as part of their policy. In other words, if it were done in violation against the school authorities, then it becomes a matter of criminal trespass. If it were done in collusion with the educational authorities in that school, in that area, then I believe that parents would have standing to sue those...
the school board, okay. Well, in this case, of course, it was trespass. Well, we have to take a break right now. We'll be right back with Jeff Bell and Greg Erken, and we have a call from Santa Fe, New Mexico, as soon as we get back. Welcome back to American Family, where we're discussing parental rights with Jeff Bell and Greg Erken of The People. And if you want to join the conversation, please give us a call at 1-800-5000-NET. And of course, we have someone who's called that number already from Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Good evening, folks. I appreciate your program. And
Thank you.
As an American being sued by the Justice Department over water rights, and I realize this doesn't have anything to do with parental rights, but I'd like to ask a question of your lawyer friend, Mr. Bell, having to do with lawyers. It comes from a publication called Legal Watch. And one of the questions they ask there is, can America afford 70% of the world's lawyers, creating the highest tort tax in the world with over 18 million legal actions filed annually at a cost of $300 billion? And that's my question, and as a person being persecuted by the federal government, I appreciate an answer. Thank you.
Well, first of all, good luck in your suit. That's something we have dealt with on the show previously.
Second, I have to
is
vouch
use
for
of
Jeff
property
Bell.
rights.
I have to vouch for Jeff Bell. He is not a lawyer.
Neither is Greg. As a matter of fact, when the four of us,
There's not a single
there's not
lawyer.
a single lawyer, which in Washington, D.C. is a very mighty feat.
Just call this a ghetto, huh?
Yeah, that's right. Well, what do you...
But you do have, I bet you do have an answer to that question, which is a
Yeah,
very serious question.
I do have a couple of thoughts. It seems to me that the legal profession has gone wrong to the degree that it's become a kind of elite, a super elite. 30, 40, 50 years ago, I don't believe that was as much the case. Yes, we did have a high number of lawyers per capita, but there are some good reasons for that. The more of an established written constitution you have, the more likely you are to have a number of lawyers, because the law and the amendments have to be interpreted. But where we went overboard was not so much in the numbers of lawyers as their attitude. The law schools about 30 years ago in this country, starting with Yale and spreading quickly to Columbia, Harvard, some of the others, started teaching law students that they were the real rulers of society. That because the Supreme Court could make a decision like Brown versus Board, Roe versus Wade, that meant that lawyers in the form of the courts could be the ultimate arbiters of society, and the law profession began to see itself as more and more of an elite and to take on this status of the real arbiters of society. That's where the legal profession started to go wrong.
And if I can give you a little plug, Jeff, this is some of the thinking that's reflected in your 1992 book, Populism versus Elitism, right, which is a very fine book.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Background on Jeff Bell. Not a lawyer, but an author and a very, very good thinker.
Well, and we do have somebody else who wants to get in on this conversation and talk with our lawyer and thinker, and that is from Coquilala, Idaho. Coquilala, you're on the line.
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Thanks.
I think it'd be a wonderful idea if we, the next time those lesbians or any other group, whatever the gays are, the next time they show up at one of these schools or whatever, they should be taped. And if one of them stands in front of someone and impedes the progress to hand them a leaflet or something, let's RICO them. That's what they're trying to do to the others. Let's do it to them and see how long that law will last if it turns out that the gays and the rest of the pigs of the world get a little of their own medicine. I'm going to hang up and listen to your answer.
What
Thank
he's
you.
referring to, of course, is the new RICO legislation, the new interpretation, influence corrupt organization law, which says that abortion protesters can face federal charges under RICO statutes, which was originally put in place to capture mafia criminals in the late 60s and early 70s. Doesn't ever seem to be used against labor groups or organized gay activists, only against conservatives, but that's an interesting comment. And you were saying, Greg, that maybe these parents in this case in Springfield might have a civil suit. They may be able to go after them as having violated their children in some way in a civil suit, not just criminal trespassing.
That's right. With the amendment more firmly establishing the principle that parental rights are a fundamental right, then our lawyer friends do tell us that it does hold the potential for hitting them with a civil action.
Okay.
And
now, of course, one of the big projects of your organization is filing these amendments in each state and hoping to see each state pass a Parental Rights Amendment. But you're also doing some other interesting things, and you were telling me about what's going on in Washington, D.C. as far as condom distribution. You're going to be involved in that. What's that all about?
Well, earlier we mentioned this big victory for parental rights which happened in New York State. An appellate court, it was just at the end of '93, declared New York City's program, which distributes condoms in the public schools without any parental notice or consent, to be an unconstitutional violation of parental rights. Now, the court said two things there. It said that condom distribution was a health service, not an educational service. And New York already had a statute that said any health service had to have parental consent. So that's strike one against the condom crowd. Strike two was they cited those cases, those Supreme Court cases from the 1920s, Myers and Pierce, in saying that the condom distribution without consent was a violation of the federal constitutional parental rights. So we are going to build on that big victory in New York, and we are planning to file a lawsuit here in the District of Columbia, which has a
Where,
very
of course,
similar...
They do have a condom distribution
Right,
plan
in the public schools with no
and the
parental
public health
consent.
commissioner has said he doesn't care if parents object, the kids still get the condoms.
Right, we've got some really egregious violations of parental rights going on.
And we'll talk about that as soon as we get back from this break. But right now we do have to take a break, so stay with us and come back to American Family. Welcome back to American Family. Our topic is parental rights, and our guests are Jeff Bell and Greg Erken of the new organization Of the People.
Greg, you were telling us about the lawsuit you plan to file in Washington.
That's right.
When do you expect to introduce that suit?
Well, we are in the process of talking to some pro bono attorneys that wish to do the legal action for us.
And you have plaintiffs identified?
That's
and so
correct.
Forth?
That's
And
correct.
what will it be based on?
Well, we will cite that New York decision first and foremost, which it was a real beauty for us because not only does it have a practical effect, striking down a condom program, but they cited those Supreme Court cases upon which our amendment is based.
Okay.
So
Well, what about finding, for instance, a defendant who, or I mean, sorry, finding a litigant who was injured? In other words, let's say they had received a condom and then proceeded to use it and got pregnant, or proceeded to use it and got AIDS.
An
And
STD,
keep in
or-
mind, or any STD, or keep in mind that, as Mike pointed out, the health commissioner in D.C. specifically told school officials, particularly nurses, that he didn't care if a 14-year-old's mother and father both wrote a note saying, "Do not, under any circumstances, give my child a condom," and sign their names. He directed the nurses to disregard those notes and hand out the condoms anyway to the child, no matter what their parents thought of it. What if that child were to go and get an STD or get pregnant? Wouldn't that be a great way to go about this?
well, it wouldn't be so great for the child.
No,
I
it would
think
be
that's-
horrible for the child, but if you found something awful like that had happened, to be able to use
that would
that.
increase the chances of victory in the suit, but lawyers tell us that it isn't necessary, that it's just a
I
prospective
see.
harm that could be done. If you can demonstrate that, then you can win the suit. In fact, in New York, they didn't have anyone like that who had already suffered. There was just students who might be affected by it in the future.
Gotcha.
And the case is not, it will not turn so much on the physical threat to the child. It's simply the fact that the parents do not want
Right.
their child subject
The
to
matter
the
of principle.
condom
Gotcha.
distribution.
Well, we have somebody else who wants to get in on this conversation from Danville, Iowa. Danville, you're on the line.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
Thanks for calling.
I'm curious why you think that the only thing those people can be charged with is trespassing for passing out condoms or those dreadful valentines, trying to entice the girls to become one of them. It would seem to me that that's contributing to the delinquency of a minor. It's also child endangerment because of the condom distribution. It certainly is sexual harassment, and I understand there was a phone number there that was that when the girls called
Right.
it, they got some kind of a pornographic message so they could get them on pornography.
Those are all great points. What the newspaper said, as I read it, was that right now they're just looking at trespassing charges. That's all the school officials seem to want to pursue them on. Parents are outraged, and my guess is you will see them file just those kinds of suits.
My guess is this
Yeah.
lady should be a prosecutor.
I was just going to say,
Absolutely.
I think she ticked off a number of things.
Right.
But
She's onto something.
that's quite brilliant, and I hope that somebody from Springfield, Massachusetts is watching so they can pick up on those ideas if they haven't already, and my guess is they will, but great points.
Thanks very much for the suggestions.
Right.
Jeff, the amendment that you all have proposed, it raises some questions in my mind because it is a statement almost without any qualifications. Parents have, the right of parents to control the upbringing and education of their children shall not be infringed. Does that mean, for example, that any state that passes this would then be obliged to, for instance, adopt a voucher system for education? Does it mean that that child abuse laws would have to be set aside? You know, how far does this go? Where are the limits on?
It would not in any way set aside criminal provisions such as child abuse laws.
Why?
You just can't. It can't overrule that. There's no way that it could.
Well,
misparenting
ordinarily,
would be excused.
yeah.
It's only parental rights in the sense of the normal functioning of parents.
Ordinarily, a constitutional provision, though, would outweigh a state statute, and the state statutes cover, for instance, child abuse laws. Couldn't a parent argue, well, I was just exercising my right to raise my child the way I see fit, keep him in a closet,
Child
and not
abuse
feed him?
abuse and neglect have always been understood as not an exercise of a right, but an abdication of the parental right
So that's an established
to raise
principle
their
in law?
children.
And there's no right to hurt a child. What about somebody arguing that it would mandate a voucher system?
Well, I do believe that it would have major implications for public school choice. In other words, if parents really were in charge and there were 2 available public schools and the school system said send your kid to school A and the parent said, no, wait a minute, I have parental rights under this amendment, I would prefer to send it to school B. I really believe that that would help that parent be able to do that. I don't think it would mandate that he be given a subsidy or she be given a subsidy to send it to a private school or create private schools, but in and of itself, although I happen to be for that, I don't think that the Parental Rights Amendment would do that, but I do think it would have a lot of implications for public school choice.
We have the text of the Parental Rights Amendment available so our viewers can take a look at it, read it for themselves, and make their own judgments about what they think its implications are. But what are you doing to move this forward? You trying to get it introduced?
Sure. A moment ago we talked about our overall strategy is to bypass the federal Congress.
And
to work in the
has
state.
it been adopted by any state yet?
No,
You're
it is
working
not.
on that?
Yeah, we're very close to having it introduced in New York and Wisconsin.
Well, let's take a look at it for just a second. It says the right of parents to direct the upbringing and education of their children shall not be infringed. And the second part of it is the legislature shall have power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article.
Well, let's take a quick break right now while we meditate those words. Please stay with us. We'll be right back after these messages. We're back with Jeff Bell and Greg Erken discussing parental rights. And if you want to join our conversation, give us a call at 1-800-5000-NET.
And right now, we already have Vineland, New Jersey on the line. Of course, New Jersey is Jeff's home state. So, Vineland, you're on the line. Well, Vineland's on the line, but we just can't hear him yet. So we're going to ask him to hold for just a second while we turn him up.
And I think we might be ready. Can we hear you in Vineland, New Jersey? Nope. We lost him.
Okay. No Vineland. Call back, Vineland.
All right.
Jeff, I have to admit I'm still a little bit confused. And I don't understand how this equation got turned around in America. It used to be for so long that it was understood that American parents had rights when it came to their children as well as responsibilities. What happened to so turn that around that we have to go state by state with an amendment to get those fundamental rights back?
I believe that the people who are in charge of the education establishment, the education schools, honestly believe that they are better able than the average parent to make major decisions about the coming generation. I believe that is the root of it. Now, another factor I have to think is the rise of feminism left a lot of people feeling that parenting had less status, that careers were more important than taking charge of your children's future. Obviously, that was accompanied by a rise in daycare and by two-earner families and all the rest. But if I had to pick one reason, it was that first reason. It was the bureaucrats, the elites, thinking that, and it's a genuinely honest opinion, that they really know what children should learn.
Now that seems to suggest the answer to my next question, but who do you expect to oppose the Parental Rights Amendment in state legislatures?
Well, I think that...
who is your likely opposition? Where's your opposition going to come from?
Well, I think that insofar as the meat and potatoes of the violations of parental rights occur in the public education system,
Right. So
I
you
think that
the
perhaps
NEA
the
is
teachers'
gonna be...
unions can smell this coming and know that it represents a direct threat because they, long ago moved from reading, writing, and arithmetic into, teaching values, clarification,
Who else?
etc.
Legal profession.
Lawyers, they won't like it.
That'd
Oh,
be my
yes,
guess,
because they
yeah.
want to represent children in lawsuits against their
That's
parents.
right, this isn't fun for
Trial
them.
lawyers.
Well, we do have Violin, New Jersey back on the line, so
Oh,
we're
good.
going to take him right now. Violin, you're on the line.
Yes, good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to find out how I get in touch with this organization that Greg's running. And second of all,
Could you repeat that first question, please, caller? I'm sorry, we didn't hear it well.
okay, how do you get in touch with this organization for the people?
Okay.
And second of all, would H.R. 6 being a federal law imposed on your state legislation that you're pushing? And third of all, I'd just like to make the point that in Russia, 3 years ago, they used to have government schools like we have now. And when Hitler rose to power, he controlled the youth, since we're starting now with the government controlling the children now at age 3. I'd like to hear some comments on this. Thank you.
I can take care of point one. We can put the address of the people up on the screen, and if you don't mind talking over that, Jeff and Greg, you can answer questions 2 and 3. What's the implication of H.R. 6 and legislation like that, and the government control of children?
Well, H.R. 6, the federal reauthorization of the education program, it did have a number of threats, as I understand it, to parents educating their children either in a home school or private school environment. Fortunately, a lot of the homeschooling community rose up, overwhelmed Washington last week, I think, and did get an amendment passed to
But
protect.
wouldn't a federal statute override a state constitutional provision?
I cannot, I'm not sure about that.
I think so. We've got the supremacy clause in the Constitution. So if the federal government passed a law in direct conflict with the state constitution, the feds win. What about the other point the caller raised about the control of children?
No question. Dictators, new order type people with an ideology to impose on the world or even on their own people always start with trying to get control of the next generation.
And so political freedom, even for people who aren't parents, political freedom depends on keeping families strong and protecting the rights of parents.
Well,
right?
that's an interesting point in itself. The Parental Rights Amendment was written to command the support not just of people who are directly interested, namely parents who have children at the formative age, but also people whose children may be grown up. People who are non-parents should agree with the same principle, that parents should have the primary responsibility, and I think most non-parents do agree with it.
And that's because the basic principle that as long as there are independent things in society, families, churches, corporations, and so forth, the government can't control everything. You have powers divided up. It's one of the ways a system like ours works.
And we believe in the people. I mean, our
Right.
Declaration of Independence is supposed to be about the people being able better to rule themselves than some monarch. And who is the equivalent of the monarch today? Well, maybe the profession, the judiciary, you name it. But we believe that's why we named our group Of the People, because we do think that parents at the grassroots are best able to shape the future of their children.
And you've obviously worded the amendment in such a way that it's going to be very hard for even the most liberal state legislator to oppose this.
Well, that's an interesting point in and of itself, because we're kind of taking a leaf from the other side, namely the Equal Rights Amendment. I think conservatives, in resisting, even though successfully resisting, the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment at the federal level, they found themselves often on the defensive, trying to say, well, why would you be against equality for women? They found themselves often on the defensive, trying to say, well, why would you be against equality for women? And of course, conservatives aren't against women rising in the world and having equal pay.
It was what that amendment actually meant.
But it was, you had to constantly keep explaining yourself. We want to put the other side in the position for a change.
All right.
Okay, and we have to put ourselves in the position of going to a commercial. So stay with us, and we'll have some final thoughts on the subject when we come back. Well, as we wrap up our discussion with Jeff Bell and Greg Erken, I want to remind you that this is your last chance to give us a call, just for tonight's program, but it's your last chance at 1-800-5000-NET.
Jeff, what are your plans for broadening the coalition on behalf of this amendment? I know your organization is new. You've just begun to fight. You've launched a new idea. But do you anticipate building big coalitions in the states and nationally to get a wide movement of citizens behind it?
Absolutely. I think that people working on everything from condom distribution to vouchers to fighting the abortion for minors. I think that they'll all be interested in this and see the point, see the relevance of it to their efforts.
So you're going to try to do a lot of networking with parents groups, anti-OBE groups, pro-life organizations.
I think the fights up there in New York City, first over the curriculum, the rainbow curriculum, where they ended up throwing the chancellor out, and secondly the condom fight, those were all largely driven by Hispanics and African-American communities, etc. They don't think of themselves as conservative necessarily. They are populist in Jeff's sense. They want to decide what is best for their children.
Well, that's interesting, is that, as you mentioned, those fights were led by primarily non-whites, which drives the liberals up a wall because they can't quite explain that. And if you were to go to some of these parents who are outraged about their children having to read the books Heather Has Two Mommies, they wouldn't tell you they're conservative, but when it comes down to core values, they're very pro-family. How do you continue, how do you reach them without putting them off and having them think, oh, I don't want to get involved in your conservative organization, even though they might very much share your beliefs?
It's going to be issue-driven. I mean, we want to have an argument about who should be raising the children, who should be preparing them for life. Should it be educational bureaucrats, or should the primary responsibility be of the parents? And if we have that argument, if we can pose the argument in those terms, there's no question how parents like that, even if they would avoid the conservative label like the plague, are going to come down.
We're not asking them to join the overall conservative movement. We are affording them a chance to rally around the banner of parental rights.
You know, it's interesting you should mention New York, because it struck me exactly a year ago tonight, on this date, I was in New York City with the very people who had defeated the rainbow curriculum, the same people who were the plaintiffs in this lawsuit you mentioned. William Alfonso and Jack Hartigan was the attorney, doing a television special on the revolt of New York City parents against Chancellor Fernandez's policies. And I saw with my own eyes and talked to these people, and they want to protect their families. They don't have a political agenda. They're not interested in great issues of philosophy. They want to protect their children. And if you can get if you can connect with that feeling, which really exists across the country, I think you may be on something that could be very big.
Michael, it is a thermonuclear force waiting to happen, and that's what we want to try to tap.
But it's Greg's job to detonate the...
That's right,
That's right.
Well, then what's the next step? You're going to pursue in state legislatures around the country, get state legislators to introduce this amendment. What else?
That's right. Well, as you mentioned, we're a relatively new, young, but growing organization. Next year, I think we plan to expand our efforts to include voter initiatives, direct petition gathering by the citizens, take it right to the ballot.
How many states have referenda? Isn't it around 25?
I think it's about 25 or 30.
Have the ability to actually go about the referendum process.
In not all of those can you amend the state constitution by ballot sometimes. So it's state by state strategy. Sometimes the legislature will be easier, sometimes voter initiative. It just depends.
Well, our viewers got to see your address and phone number in the last segment, so I'm sure if anybody's interested in helping of the people move the Parental Rights Amendment, they'll have an opportunity to get in touch with you. Are you working, trying to connect with statewide leaders and so forth? Is that your strategy?
That's correct. That's correct.
You want to know who's who in Iowa and who's who in New Hampshire, and get in touch with the people who are in the organizations.
That's right. That's right.
What are the overall chances for success? We've only got a little bit of time left, not just for your amendment, but for recapturing, for parents, for our children, for getting back to some sense of sanity in the long term.
Well, I think there's been a lot of frustration that no matter what we do on our side, they seem to come back with some court decision or something that overturns everything. But I honestly believe that the support of the other side on issues of this type is a mile wide and 1/8 of an inch deep. I really believe it's a corrupt and very fragile empire that they have that's ready to be pushed over if the people can find a way to rally.
So in the 80s, Jeff Bell helped President Reagan bring down the Soviet empire, and in the 90s, your mission is to bring down the empire of the bureaucrats.
Do whatever I can.
The current threat.
Well, that's all we have time for today. We want to thank our guests, Jeff Bell and Greg Erken of The People, and we thank you for joining us in American Family. Let us know what you think of our program and what topics you'd like to see covered on American Family. Write to us at American Family, care of NET, 717 2nd Street Northeast, Washington, D.C. 20002.
And do stay tuned to NET for Capitol Watch, which has some special guests this evening. And thank you for joining us, and do come back tomorrow night.